Hello and welcome to my channel. The title of this video is The Goblin Market, a critical examination of the missionary appeals to Hindus, Part 1. Introduction. Morning and evening, maids heard the goblins cry, "Come buy our orchard fruits, come buy, come buy." Unquote. In the Victorian narrative poem Goblin Market by Christina Rossetti, two naive sisters are tempted by roaming goblins who sell a variety of luscious fruits from their baskets and carts. When one of the sisters yields and begins to indulge, the sweet fruits reveal their darker character. There is much in this floating world, as the Japanese poets call it, that is not what it seems and is not what it offers. This is why, whenever we hear the calls of "come buy," we should be circumspect. This applies to those who wish to sell their religious views as well. Many of the loudest voices in the marketplace with carts of fruit to sell are the Christian missionaries. In this study, I am not criticizing the quest to convert individuals to Christianity in any general sense, but rather I am focused on one particular campaign and style, the missionary appeals to Hindus. The dominant motivation for this, on my part, is that the tactics and sources which are used in these appeals are often fraudulent and highly abusive of Vedic sources. There is nothing more hypocritical than claiming to speak for the cosmic truth, the eternal logos, while doing so with distortions and lies. There are four primary intellectual appeals that the Christian missionaries make in their efforts to convert Hindus to their faith. These are the devotional appeal, the historical appeal, the soteriological appeal, or the Vedic sacrifices are fulfilled by the sacrifice of Christ, which only accounts for sin and atonement, and finally, the prophetic appeal, based on their readings of passages mainly from the Vedas Samhitas. These are the carts from which the missionaries offer their fruits. In this study, I will present the missionaries' appeals and arguments accurately and, while set in the broader metaphor of Rossetti's poem, neutrally in themselves to avoid the charge of mischaracterization. This is my Libra ascendant coming into play, I guess. Then I shall examine their accuracy and truth value based solidly on the objective material in the corpus of Vedic literature, which can be verified with ease. I have decided that in this particular study, I will focus primarily, but not exclusively, on the sources from the Vedic era, which dates academically from 1700 BC to 500 BC itself because of their authority within Hinduism. In addition to these four carts, we will also pick through the offerings in two fruit baskets, one of mantras and the other of prophetic literature from the Puranas, which is said to contain references to the risen Christ. This is part one of this study, and in this I will focus exclusively on the first two appeals, which are the devotional and historical. I am certain that the fair-minded and thoughtful who honestly examine these issues will conclude about the missionaries that their goblin fruits are exactly that, and the warnings of the poem apply quote, "We must not look at goblin men. We must not buy their fruits. Who knows upon what soils they fed their thirsty, hungry roots?" Unquote. The first fruit cart, the devotional appeal, long tassels and orange robes. Apples and quinces, external religion without devotion. In a video explaining the reason for his conversion from Hinduism to Christianity that can be found on YouTube, a young Brahmin named Murali concluded his testimony with the following remark, quote, "Christianity is not a caste or a religion, but an intimate relationship between God and his people." Unquote. There is a hidden claim here, which is that Hinduism really is nothing but caste and formal religion that is devoid of an emotional connection to the divine. This encapsulates one of the primary appeals that missionaries make to Hindus. The missionaries will often quote verses from the New Testament scriptures in which Christ was critical of the Jewish Pharisees, such as Matthew 23, for their hypocrisy and adherence to external ritual purity and actions alone as the only moral standards, while completely neglecting compassion and inner dimensions of faith. The missionaries then apply these same critiques to the followers of Orthodox Hinduism in general and the Brahmins in particular. Thus, they are able to create identification between the Pharisees and the Brahmins to persuade potential converts who are seeking a deeper connection and experience of the spiritual that Christ shares their skepticism of external and formal religion. The missionaries then tell them they should dismiss the Hinduism of the Brahmins as nothing but empty sets of meaningless actions alone, and turn to the Christian answer for their psychological needs for an inner path of the heart which leads to grace. As the Levitical rites of the Hebrew temple were portrayed as a stiff and dead letter that was unable to move men's stony hearts to the divine, the same is said by the missionaries of the Hindu temples. They would ask questions of Hindus such as, "What benefit can one derive from hearing mumbled phrases in a language no one understands, and leaving bowls sitting around in front of pieces of wood and stone?" Hinduism, they claim, is the opposite of Christianity because it has no sense of the inner man's longings and tries to cover this void with meaningless rites which are colorful and musically vibrant to distract the individual senses and attach one to superficiality alone. But Christianity, they say, is about the inner man. Lemons and oranges. False devotion to evil entities. Traditionally, whenever the missionaries do admit that there are devotional paths within Hinduism, they have portrayed them as shallow manifestations of superstition or outright devotion to demonic entities for the crassest material gains alone. To Westerners, this constellates the archetype of the pact with Satan. An example of such sentiments can be found in the 19th century Sanskrit scholar MacDonnell, who wrote regarding the Supreme Lord, whom he viewed as, quote, the impure and repulsive character of the post-Vedic Shiva, unquote. What a sweetheart, eh? While there are many mainline Protestant missionaries who will soften such expressions when interacting with Hindus on a personal level to avoid offending them, although they may actually hold such sentiments, there are many Christians who still think of the Devas as the devil's own green berets from hell who are out to trick foolish people. When the image of Kali Ma was projected onto the Empire State Building in downtown New York at the end of a wildlife display in the summer of 2015, it was decried by some, among them Theodore Schubat, as an active appeal by the New York State government to persuade people to worship the devil. Others saw in this a celebration of abortion because the Divine Mother is, quote, Planned Parenthood's goddess, unquote. I'm not sure which Purana that's in, but you know how it goes. According to them, she revels in the mutilation of unborn children. Thus, one of the appeals of the missionaries to Hindus is that the Devas are demons. Devotion to them is an impure and false devotion, which only leads one to suffering in this world and damnation in the next. The mantras they will tell you create a demonic miasma. In support of this claim, they will cite their terrible and ferocious forms, as well as, very commonly, the presence of serpents. The two primary targets of this condemnation have already been mentioned: the Supreme Lord Mahadeva and the Divine Mother. Lord Shiva in particular is seen as a manifestation of the Christian devil. The reason for this is what is perceived to be his character as the destroyer, which is often set in opposition to Christ, who is the Prince of Peace. Further, he bears the trident and is adorned with cobras. The trident is identified as the pitchfork with which Satan is portrayed in the medieval church, but is also condemned as an instrument of abomination because the three-pronged fork was used by the scandalous sons of the Hebrew priest Eli in the Old Testament book of Samuel. That the image of the devil with a pitchfork is unknown before the 10th century AD, of course, when first used on a sculpture in an Irish monastery, while the Lord's Trishul long predates this, and Hindu literature and iconography is a fact of little concern to the missionaries. Details generally we will find in this study are not something that they're really very focused on. The cobra, which adorns the Lord, who is actually the Naga king Vasuki, is naturally seen as the very snake which appeared in the Garden of Eden itself. The evangelical exorcist Bob Larson has claimed that Lord Shiva is a demon, and the preacher defeated him in spiritual combat by exorcising him from a girl named Sonia. Thus, the elderly human pastor claims to have succeeded where Andakasura did not. To many missionaries, the goddess Kali is a violent and ruthless hurricane of evil who demands blood to please her. Much of this in Western culture is conditioned by the 1984 film Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, when Theodore Shribat published his aforementioned ravings about government-sponsored Satanism. He linked to clips from the Hollywood film as, in his own words, proof of the demonic nature of the goddess. One Christian website, aggressivechristianity.net, claims that she is mesmerizing people to become gangsta thugs worldwide and is part of a coalition of hellish goddesses animating American rap music. Quote, "The fascination of the youth with death, the absorption in crime and murder is only too evident that the roots of rap are evil, and those who adhere to the ultimate message are adhering to the demands of goddess spirits, every bit as cruel and bloodthirsty as Kali, the goddess queen of Hinduism," unquote. And it always brings such strange images to mind. Kali Ma in a rap video. I can't process it. I need to move on. Actually, maybe I need a drink after that. This contains no alcohol, I should mention. Critique of the missionaries' devotional appeal. Examination: the historical devotional path Bhakti Yoga in the subcontinent. Can only Christians love God? The claim that Hinduism is simply sets of ritual actions akin to magical formulae without an inner dimension or a devotional path is false. Man has taken such an approach in his historical relationship with the divine in the subcontinent since the very beginning of the recorded thought of the ancient seers. The roots of devotion run wide and deep. To deny this requires blindness to an astonishing amount of Sanskrit literature. A very brief historical overview will suffice to validate this claim. Pardon me. Vedic era. The heart is a central image in the Rig Veda, the most ancient of the Vedas. Despite the claims that this work is absorbed only in formal ritual, there are many hymns where the seers make clear that there was an inner path of devotion that is centered on the heart, which is viewed by them as predominantly important. This is expressed in one way through meditation, as well as focus on the emotions upon the Devas, whom the sages advise to cherish in our hearts. This is clearly devotional love of God. Quote, when may we repeat the most grateful hymn to the wise, the most bountiful, and the mighty Rudra, who is cherished in our hearts, unquote. Further, all the Vedic rites have an inner meaning which applies to the individual as a form of inner work. For the Vedic sacrificial relationship with the Devas to unfold its full spectrum of potential, it must have this inner component. The outer ritual of the Soma sacrifice, for example, is reflective of an inner process. This is not a homiletical interpretation or a modern speculative projection onto the hymns of the seers. The sages themselves assert this exact point. They say clearly the Soma is drunk in the heart. Additionally, they teach that the reason this is so is to attain light. This is the path to immortality. Thus, we see that there is a devotional path which is focused upon the inner experience and connection to the divine inherent in Vedic ritual. An additional distinction, an additional dimension of the Vedic devotional path is that the seers sought the friendship of the Devas. In the ancient world, this is strikingly unique. The general trend of human cultures is to see the gods as distant. Quote, "We invoke to be our friend Indra, who is attended by the Maruts," unquote. While not deeply read in the literature of the Sumerians, although I have read all of Zecharia Sitchin's work, not that that qualifies, given the nature of their gods, I doubt friend was an adjective very much applied by anyone. In Greece, Aristotle said it was absurd to love a god. There is also no such idea of this type of relationship between man and the divine in the Hebrew scriptures. Lord Indra is called a friend of man, but where is the same said of the first person of the Christian Trinity? While Jehovah mandates that the Israelites love him, this is in the same manner of a command as that which states they are to fear him. It is not based on any bonds save those which are purely formal and legal. Jehovah himself expresses this when he speaks of their relationship always as a covenant. He may have spoken to Moses as a friend, but this is metaphoric, and never does it say that such a connection actually existed. The seers of the Vedas were friends with the Devas, but no biblical prophet was a friend of Jehovah. The epic and Puranic eras. In the era of the epics and the Puranas, one of the primary exponents of the path of devotion was Lord Krishna. This teaching is recorded in the Bhagavad Gita. There, the 8th avatar of Lord Vishnu makes it clear that those who may be constitutionally unable to pursue paths of renunciation of the world and austerities are not excluded from communion with the divine. The path of devotion is always open to them. He states, quote, "Whoever offers to me with devotion a leaf, a flower, a fruit, or water, I accept that offering of devotion from such a pious devotee. I am the same in all beings. None I hate nor particularly like, but those who worship me with devotion, they stand in me, and I also in them. Even if an exceedingly wicked man worships me with undistracted devotion, he must be considered as a good man, for he possesses discrimination. Quickly, he becomes the embodiment of righteousness and attains eternal peace. I give you my word, O son of Kunti, that my devotees never perish. Unquote. Lord Krishna, in this same chapter, advises Arjuna exactly how one may become one of those devotees whom he has just mentioned. Quote, merge your mind with me, be devoted to me, sacrifice to me, thus established in yoga with me as your highest goal, you will come to me. Unquote. While unscrupulous missionaries will attempt to manipulate individuals who have been unfortunate enough to experience caste prejudice to paint all Hinduism with that brush, the Logos, or cosmic order speaking through Lord Krishna, has made it explicitly clear that none are excluded from this path to reach the divine. Quote, those who take refuge in me, O Partha, even if of low origin, women, Vaishyas, or Shudras, they also attain the highest goal. Unquote. This is a far cry from the vision of Hinduism that missionaries will fabricate in their propaganda. It has always been the teaching of the sages of the subcontinent, but that the divine is readily accessible in the human heart. The ethnic, social, and intellectual condition of the individual is no matter. This is distinct from the Christian view that the divine is reducible to a historically conditioned and transient sectarian path, and that particular approach alone. The modern era. Many millions of Hindus follow the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita, even if they do not regard Lord Vishnu as the Supreme Lord. But advocates of this path who frame it in the language and needs of our own era are not lacking. One of the most influential was Ramakrishna. Concerning the path of love, he wrote, quote, nothing can be impressed on smooth glass, but once a surface is coated with proper chemicals, pictures can be impressed upon it, as in photography, at least in his day. In the same way, the human heart, coated with the chemicals of bhakti, devotion, the image of divinity can be impressed. Unquote. There are a number of other modern writers on this subject who offer guidance to individuals of all levels of practice. Any bookstore is filled with such books. It is also expressed by musical artists such as Krishna Das and Deva Premal, among many others. Conclusion. There is an ancient and vibrant path and tradition of love of God within Hinduism that still continues to flourish in our own era. When the missionaries claim that they alone hold the keys to unlock the inner man and the spiritual in harmony in humanity, it is a grossly exaggerated claim which ignores both the documented evidence and the values of the Hindu community as it exists today. Examination. The Devas are devils. Symbol literacy. Symbols and images of all types are inherently empty of themselves. They might be conceived of as abstract boxes into which meaning is placed. This may be done by an individual who is creating his own personal expression or acting as a conduit for the collective and cultural definitions which are associated with such constructs. The wider the gulf between cultures, the greater must be the information absorbed to build a bridge in order to correctly read what these distinctive symbols are communicating. Hindu iconography is a complete language in itself. Not only does this apply to the most obvious aspects of images, such as their terrible forms, but extends to small details, such as the position of the hands, for example. Westerners who have not been instructed in this subject often quite literally do not know what they're looking at. And this includes myself in many ways, since I've not focused, on that area in particular. In the West, the Greek Orthodox tradition is probably closer to the Hindu tradition in the use of a complex symbolic lexicon, but that is alien to most missionaries who are generally Protestant and lack a visual liturgical tradition. Thus, the claim of the missionaries that aspects of Hindu art are really manifestations of evil, such as all snakes are the snake in the Garden of Eden, or the wrathful forms of the Devas are satanic, is completely baseless. It has no objective intellectual value. This is purely projection and misunderstanding. Violence in Christian iconography. To test the validity of this proposition, which I have just asserted, we can apply it to Christian art itself. The missionaries will often present very peaceful images of Christ and saints with halos gazing at the clouds. But this is a limited selection of the historical work. The Renaissance Spanish painters in particular presented Christian images which were particularly violent and graphic. They are perhaps the closest to the modern film The Passion of the Christ by Gibson, which reflects the full horror of Roman torture. For an individual from a culture which was not informed by Christianity, what would these symbols communicate? He might conclude that Christ was a horrible criminal to be treated in such a manner, and thus he would support the enemies of Christ. This was the conclusion of the Chinese main character in the novel The Good Earth by Pearl S. Buck when he was first presented a lithograph of the crucifixion by a missionary. Or he might come to believe that this is a dangerous sadomasochistic cult which is a threat to society and should be suppressed. Such things just don't conform to family values. The dynamic is exactly what is at work when missionaries comment on Hindu iconography and decry it as satanic images such as they found on the covers of heavy metal albums in the 1980s. Lord Shiva and Kali Ma contrasted with Jehovah. Aside from the more abstract argument just presented, is it in fact true that the Devas are evil? Let us pause for a moment to briefly contemplate the textual records and discover if the reputations the missionaries are presenting of their own God and the Devas are accurate. Is Jehovah, the God of love, purity, and holiness, compared to the wrathful demon lords of India? Lord Shiva, the destroyer. The Christian and Hebrew God Jehovah is not peaceful. This is sung by the Israelites at the crossing of the Red Sea when they say of him, quote, Jehovah is a man of war, Jehovah is his name, unquote. He also advocated combat and genocide on several occasions, such as in Deuteronomy 2 and Joshua 6. Even when the Israelites complained that their God was killing too many of them, he responded by killing 14,000 more with the plague in Numbers 16. Thus, he possesses destructive aspects. Those who are his believers historically have not been peaceful either. Under his inspiration, the psalmist, for example, calls for a revolting act that one would have expected from the Nazis in World War II or ISIS in our own era. Quote, happy shall he be that taketh and dasheth thy little ones against the stones, unquote, Psalms 137:9. It is highly hypocritical for missionaries to attack the Supreme Lord on the basis of his function as destroyer, even misunderstanding it as they do, without even going into that. Given the moral record of the first person of the Trinity in his own oracles, I am unaware of anywhere where the spirit, to borrow their terminology, of Lord Shiva praises the murder of infants in the manner Jehovah does. One is left to wonder why he did not follow his own laws and turn the other cheek to forgive both the Egyptians and the Babylonians. But this is even more hypocritical, since Jesus specifically said regarding little children, quote, it is better to put a millstone around one's neck and jump into the sea rather than harm one of these little ones, in Luke 18. The Judeo-Christian God does not seem to be a being which follows his own laws. It's that classical statement in English, do as I say, not as I do. Kali Ma. Even having seen something of the nature of the Christian God, based upon imagery alone, many may still wonder if the wild and wrathful goddess is more dangerous and violent than Jehovah. But is she really arbitrary and violent. In the Puranas, the deaths attributed to the hands of the Divine Mother are powerful asuras who posed an existential threat to the human race. We have already seen that Jehovah has destructive aspects, though denied by many Christians, which manifest towards the enemies of his people. Thus, it would seem that he is at the very least equivalent with the goddess. That conclusion is not correct. The record for arbitrary violence is clear in the Hebrew scriptures. This includes Jephthah's sacrifice of his own daughter as a burnt offering to Jehovah in payment for a victory to the Ammonites. But one of the most shocking examples is the murder of a group of admittedly obnoxious boys who expressed doubt about the assumption of the prophet Elijah in a fiery chariot into the sky. Quote, "And he, the prophet Elisha, went up from thence unto Bethel. And as he was going up by the way, there came forth little children, out of the city, and mocked him, saying unto him, Go up, thou bald head, go up, thou bald head." Well, maybe making fun of bald heads. No, still doesn't justify it. "And he turned back and looked on them, and cursed them in the name of the Lord. And there came forth 2 she-bears out of the woods, and tare 42 children of them. And he went up from thence to Mount Carmel, and from thence he returned to Samaria." Unquote. 2 Kings 2, 23-25. While the spirit of Jehovah inspired the psalmist to call for infanticide, here his holy prophet fulfills the impulse. The question must again be asked. If the prophet could not control his anger, which is a sin, anger is a sin, then why did his God not guide him to follow the divine law and forgive the boys 7 times 7, as is stated? Speaking legally, the boys did not commit any offense that is listed in the Pentateuch as meriting the death penalty. Thus, they should not have been killed. This was an extrajudicial act. That, by definition, is arbitrary violence. Conclusion. We may contrast this arbitrary child murder from a deity that is claimed to be pure goodness and holiness with legends involving children told of this goddess, whom the missionaries will tell you is satanic. Such a tale is found in the Linga Purana. One of the asuras whom she killed was Daruk. After killing him, the goddess drank his blood and became inflamed. Quote, "But even after the death of Darukasura, her anger did not subside, and the whole world was ablaze due to her anger. Lord Shiva then incarnated as a small child and started crying as if he was hungry. Goddess Kali could not decipher the illusion of Shiva and thought that the child was crying because of hunger. She started feeding the child her breast milk. In the process of sucking milk, Lord Shiva also sucked out her anger." Unquote. Even at her full fury in a wild rampage, the goddess is still clearly filled with compassion for the innocent and the helpless. The same cannot be said of Jehovah. The second fruit card, the historical appeal, primeval Aryan monotheism, plump unpecked cherries. Prajapati was the only god of the ancient Aryan tribes. Another appeal that is used by the missionaries is the claim that the ancient Aryan tribes only worshipped Prajapati as the creator god. The 5 kindred sacrificing tribes are portrayed as identical to the biblical Hebrews in their primitive monotheism. But whereas the Jews who fell into idolatry were called back to the path of Jehovah by the prophets of the Old Testament, the cunning Brahmins, those prophets of Baal, were successful in adding the worship of natural forces into the pristine Vedic religion so that they could co-opt it for the purpose of control through the caste system and to make money. Thus, in this historical appeal, by embracing Christianity, one is actually returning to the true historical roots of Hinduism as it existed in the most ancient past. The main textual source for this comes from 2 hymns in the 10th mandala of the Rig Veda. The first is the famous Purusha hymn, which is 1090, and the second is the hymn to Ka, which is 10:121. Creation is the subject of both of these hymns. The direct identification of the sole deity is given in hymn 121. Quote, Prajapati, Lord of life, Lord of creatures, and Lord of creation. Unquote. Because both of these hymns are centered on the subject of creation, it is the claim of the missionaries that the subject of both should be understood as Prajapati. It is their claim that he is, therefore, the sole creator god in the Rig Veda. As an attack on Murti Puja, or the offerings to images of various types of the Devas, which is central to modern Hinduism, the missionaries will point to a passage which they refer to as the 40th chapter of the Yajurveda or the Isopanishad. Quote, idol worshippers never enter into heaven, unquote. This first phrase of the full verse is quoted differently by other sources while maintaining the same concept, saying, quote, they sink into darkness, those who worship the natural elements, unquote. In their reading of this, the missionaries do not mean the Samkhya Tattvas or the classical 4 elements of Heraclitus, right? Why was I thinking Heracles? That's the name for the hero. But they understand this to refer to the Devas, whom they claim, of course supported by 19th century scholarship, were reducible to forces of nature alone. This is a subject I have extensively refuted elsewhere. Thus, for example, it is condemned by the sages of the Yajurveda to worship a rain god such as Indra, they claim. This apparent support of the biblical prohibition on idols in Leviticus or the fabrication of any images in Exodus is used by them to bolster the claim, that just such a primitive monotheism existed in the subcontinent. Critique of the missionaries' historical appeal. No sole creator god in the Vedas. Throughout the Vedas, the role of creator is attributed to a variety of devas. There is no deva who, like Jehovah in the Hebrew scriptures, reigns as undisputed sovereign whom all must worship and bears the title of creator by universal assent. The seers followed individual paths of devotion based upon the worship of their Ishtadeva or chosen god, who fulfills the role of Supreme Lord for them. It is interesting to note that despite this diversity of views, there is not found anywhere in the Veda Samhitas where any sage is critical of another because their chosen path to approach the divine is different. Quote, "The learned speak of the one reality in many ways. They call him Agni, Yama, and Vayu." Unquote. This view is in stark contrast to Christian history, where minority opinions about theological issues, which were not explicitly defined in the scriptures, even relatively minor ones, would be silenced at the point of a Roman spear or by the fear of being made homeless and exile. Anyone who doubts that, read Eusebius, the early church historian. In this philosophical context, in the hymns, Lord Indra is called creator and is named as the primary artifactor of the world, who spread out earth and heaven. This same title is given to Lord Agni, and Lord Varuna in other hymns is said to be the maker of earth. Other devas are also hailed as the creator, such as Lord Vishnu and Lord Vishwakarma. Even the sun is said to be creator in one hymn. Examination. Prajapati and the Judeo-Christian God. In the later Puranic literature, there is more than one Prajapati, and this is considered more a title than a specific deva. The Shrimad Bhagavatam cites Lord Vishwakarma as the lord of the 11 Prajapatis. Pardon me. Other sources arrange them differently. But this is later material, the missionaries would rightfully argue. However, in the Veda Samhitas themselves, there is still no basis to identify Prajapati with the monotheistic god of the Abrahamic religions or even a kindred entity. The creation hymns of the Rig Veda, 10th Mandala, to Purusha and Ka. The missionaries seem to hold the view that these hymns are the Sanskrit versions of the first chapter of the book of Genesis, where the Hebrew revision of the Sumerian and Akkadian creation myths is recorded. As mentioned, because Prajapati is identified in the hymn to Ka, it is argued by the missionaries that he must also be Purusha as well. For the sake of argument, let us assume that this is the case. Wilson translated the verse they cited, which I read earlier, quote, "None other than you, Prajapati, has given existence to all these beings," unquote. This is a rare case where the verse is actually close to what the missionaries claim, though they are still not fully correct. Generally, they heavily distort the text, and that is the most charitable and neutral way to put it. We have already seen that such statements are attributed to other devas, and in the context of the Vedic hymns, they should not be understood as exclusive. But beyond this, based upon the study of these two hymns, it quickly becomes clear that no Hebrew or theological constructs can be pinned onto the Prajapati there presented. The main reason for this is that if Prajapati is equated with Purusha, then Prajapati is a pantheistic deity. The seers in the Purusha hymn say, quote, "Purusha is verily all this visible world, all that is and all that is to be," unquote. All is a universal inclusive. There is nothing in the visible world that is not part of Purusha. Thus, this cannot be understood as referring to the concept of omnipresence as it is defined in Western religions, where the deity possesses total information awareness or is thought to be present in all places while yet distinct from the material of the created world. This is supported by later verses in the hymns. 3/4 of Purusha ascended, the other fourth that remained in this world proceeded repeatedly and diversified in various forms, went to all animate and inanimate creatures, unquote. Later in the hymn, it is said that animals were born from him, as well as astronomical objects. He did not create them with a material outside of himself, but with himself. If in this hymn the manifest universe is identified with the divine, this is a radically different metaphysical view than that presented in the biblical book of Genesis, where earth as an artifact forged by Jehovah with speech and completely separate from the divine. The Church Father Tatian writes on this matter of matter and the divine, quote, "For matter is not, like God, without beginning, nor, as having no beginning, is of equal power with God. It is created and not produced by other being, but brought into existence by the framer of all things," unquote, Oration Against the Greeks. Pantheism is abhorrent to the Abrahamic faiths. In the context of the Purusha hymn, were the sole creator god Prajapati identified with a fallen and cursed world because of Adam's sin, then the deity too would be equally fallen and cursed, as he is not distinct from the creation. On these grounds alone, it becomes impossible to identify Prajapati, even accepting their identification of him with Purusha, with the Judeo-Christian God. In fact, Jehovah's very holiness itself arises from his separation. In Hebrew, the word for holy is kadosh. The three-letter root of this is kuf dalad shin, or kdsh. This designates separation. The Israelites were a holy people because they were separate from the nations. That's what made them kadosh. Also in Hebrew, a prostitute is called a kadesha because she is separated for a specific purpose. Thus, there was no primeval Hebraic monotheism among the Aryan tribes. The dualistic Near Eastern worldview is the opposite of the Vedic, which is unitary. In this case, Kipling is correct. East is east, and west is west, and never the twain shall meet. Textual distinctions between Prajapati and Jehovah. The distinctions between Prajapati and Jehovah are more than philosophical. The name is fairly rare in the Rig Veda itself. He is attributed with the creation of Mitra and Varuna. There is also a clear example of this use of this name used as a title or an epitaph, which foreshadows the Puranic uses. Quote, I invoke Tivasta, or Lord Vishwakarma, the firstborn, the protector, the leader, the golden-colored, pure-flowing Indu is Indra, the showerer Prajapati, or the Lord of all creatures, unquote. Here, Prajapati is used generically as an epitaph of Lord Indra. None of the missionaries who I have read or heard anywhere identify the azure-chinned king of Devas with the Christian god. In the Atharva Veda, the word Prajapati is much more frequent. While this appears perhaps 5 times in the Rig Veda, there are over 50 references in the Atharva Veda. The Atharva Veda is a much later work historically, so the argument that Prajapati is an older god of the Aryans is once again seen as specious, since if he were older, he would be more present in the older text, especially the older section of the Rig Veda, which is called the family books. In the 4th Veda, he is identified with prana, which is equivalent to the chi of Chinese medicine, or we might say the aether of classical Western philosophy. Although I'm not sure that that's quite correct. It's close enough for government work. Quote, Prana is Deshriti and Viraj. Prana is revered by all. He is the sun. He is the moon. Prana is called Prajapati. Unquote. This is clearly not an association with the Judeo-Christian God in any way. The prana is an energetic substratum or substance, and the Hebrew God is beyond all connection with the world or substances, as the Church Father told us. There is even more evidence in support of such a distinction. One of the clearest is that Prajapati is said to have a daughter. Some Christians might identify this female figure with the wisdom or chokhmah of the Old Testament, which was with God from the beginning and speaks as an independent entity in the book of Proverbs, particularly chapter 8, which I will not quote here. But One other source in the Atharva Veda makes it clear that Prajapati cannot be the Christian god. He had a beginning in time, while the Trinity is supposed to have been self-existent beyond time. In this hymn, Kala, or time, is identified as a form of Brahma or the highest reality. Pardon me. Regarding the relationship with Prajapati, it is stated, quote, Kala embraces holy fire, the highest Brahma in himself. Yea, Kala, who was the father of Prajapati, is the Lord of all. Kala created living things and first of all Prajapati, unquote. There can be nothing anterior to God. Thus, because Kala is anterior to Prajapati, then Prajapati cannot be God in the definition of the Abrahamic faiths. Now, the missionaries, especially if they are unclever, may attempt to rationalize this hymn by claiming that the Kala of this hymn is God the Father, the first person of the Trinity, and Prajapati then would be identified as Christ, the second person of the Trinity. And they might even say that, well, the holy fire is, God the Holy Spirit, the third person Trinity. So say, aha, whoa, the whole Trinity is here. However, if this verse is read in such a manner, then they would be advocating the Arian heresy, which stated that Christ was a created being. This says explicitly, Kala created Prajapati. So if it's Jesus, you're saying Jesus is a created being. The Nicene Creed, this is very basic, states explicitly regarding the Son that he is genitum non factum consubstantialem patri, or eternally begotten, ex patre natum ante omni saecula, not made of one substance with the Father. The description of the creed does not apply to this hymn. In summary, on the grounds of logic, theology, and textual analysis, the claims of any identification at any point of history between Prajapati and the Judeo-Christian God is without foundation. A counter-argument. Vedic continuity versus biblical inconsistency. If the missionaries wish to validate an historical analysis as a means of determining the truth, then this method should be applied to study a key difference between the Vedic heritage and the biblical. In comparing the record of the two, it becomes clear which tradition is more credible. Vedic continuity. It is clear that modern Hinduism, as it is now practiced, is not absolutely identifiable with the rites of the tribal era of the Rig Veda. There have been adaptations to the needs of the community and historically conditioned change in the value system and relationships with the Devas. However, on an internal and conceptual level, there is a solid and unbroken link from the Rig Veda to modern Hinduism. The core concepts that are present in Hindu thought today are all present in the Rig Veda even if only in rudimentary forms. The sages of the Brahmanas sought to explain the Vedas, and those of the era of the Upanishads to frame the contents of the poetic verses in a philosophical format. But they were not different, only refined. Further, while there have been changes, many practices also continue, especially those at their most basic level. This is an historical record over thousands of years. It is unique in human history. Surely this is suggestive of something which should be treasured. Biblical contradictions. The same cannot be said of the Bible. There are several levels on which this subject could be explored. Here I will only focus on the contradictions which haunt biblical scholarship. The Bible itself is not a seamless whole. Such a proposition is hotly resisted, as it undermines the claim to revelation by God the Holy Spirit, at least as it is understood literally. It shows the Bible is the product of man, not God. One such contradiction would be sufficient, but what we will look at here is just a couple. Old Testament. There were giants after the flood, Numbers 13. New Testament. There were no giants after the flood, 2 Peter. Old Testament. The fathers of the 12 tribes are listed in Genesis 49. New Testament. They're given different names in Revelation 7. Old Testament. Abimelech was the high priest when David ate the showbread in 1 Samuel 21. New Testament. Abiathar was the high priest, Mark 2. Old Testament. Law given to Moses directly by God, Deuteronomy 10. New Testament. The law was given to Moses through angels, Galatians 3. Old Testament. Sacrifice removes sin, Numbers 15. New Testament. Sacrifice does not remove sin, Hebrews 10. Old Testament. Elijah went to heaven, 2 Kings 2. New Testament. Only Jesus went to heaven. The missionaries will concoct a variety of devices to bridge these gaps. One very human reason for some, but not all, of these contradictions is that those who were composing the New Testament were not using the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, but the Greek Septuagint. However, the mere fact that such efforts are required by the missionaries and Christian apologists in general to cover these holes shows in themselves that there are holes, which means there's a problem. Those who may be more informed will sometimes attempt to turn this back on Hindus and cite the contradictory nature of the Puranas to charge Hindus with hypocrisy on this matter if they point out these biblical difficulties. The difference, however, is really quite clear and really quite simple. The Puranas are not revelations, and you're not bound to believe them. One final section here. Yajurveda 40 review. Quote, "They sink into darkness, those who worship the natural elements," unquote, as the missionaries say. So the missionaries argue that this condemns idol worship, which they claim to have uncovered in the Yajurveda. So in the Vedic era, the texts are quite clear about the fact that the seers and the Brahmins could perceive the Devas present in the hall of sacrifice during the rites. This is mentioned in a number of verses, among them that they were visible upon the ox hide, which is also called Indra's station, and upon the darba grass which was strewn around the altars. For this reason, there was no cause for the seers to utilize an image in any form. In fact, they are absent from the Veda Samhitas. It was only with the turn of the ages that it became necessary to use images as a point of focus in worship. On the face of it, that the sages would say one should not worship an image or the elements of nature as gods. However, one reads this when the entire text of the Yajurveda invokes all of these devas, whom they are supposedly telling us are forces of nature by name, is really absurd. This verse as given makes no sense. A more accurate rendition with the full verse is as follows. Those people who pray Prakriti, which is lifeless, and not the Brahma, which is unborn, they enter into darkness. And those who consider that one is formed by Prakriti, implying alone, as their cause, they enter into more darkness. This verse is simply a condemnation of an atheistic and materialistic worldview. Those who are attached to such views as viewing themselves to be simply the product of matter are drawing themselves further from the awareness of the highest reality. This does not relate in any manner to what the missionaries say it does, surprisingly. As we shall see in our next section, their record of accuracy can only be described in the most charitable terms as hideous. So that concludes this section. Thank you very much.